Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hard-working Americans and their families?
You will! This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefits in your benefit plan. Now prepare to learn,
Plan,
save,
and protect with the FIA Group.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Empowering Plans Podcast. You're here today with me, Nick Bonds, one of the consulting attorneys here at the FIA Group. Also with me is my former partner in crime. It's actually been a minute. Corey, say hi.
Hello. Guess who's back? Back again. Nick and Corey on the podcast. Everyone should tell their friend.
I love it. Yes, we are back together, hot to go, as the kids are saying. I think we've got kind of an exciting format today. Corey, do you want to kind of lay out what we're going to do today to kind of break things down?
Yeah, Nick, I'm very excited to be doing the podcast today. Kind of breaking news. There's an election that's going on in 2024. Most people probably haven't heard a thing about that.
I had no idea, yeah.
Right, yeah, it really sneaks up on you, gets no news coverage.
No one's been saying anything about it all day, every day for the last month.
You're exactly right. But what Nick and I have thought would be a good thing to do with the podcast today is each of us to take one of the major candidates, listen to that as Trump and Harris, and kind of outline some of the different proposals that their respective administrations would have if they are to win the election in November. And the way that we're going to kind of format it here, we're going to go back and forth a little bit where I will be relaying some of the talking points from the Trump campaign, discussing a little bit about it, throwing it to Nick for his response or questions or critiques that he would have on that said position. And then Nick will be responding in kind with one of the Harris platforms or agenda items as it relates to healthcare. And depending on how quickly we get through, we've also reserved a couple topics that are not healthcare related that pique our interest, but we'll see whether or not we have the time to get into that. But that's going to be kind of the format here. I do think it's important here to just say that we're not endorsing any candidate when it comes to this podcast here. The goal of this podcast is just to inform, is to get out into open for you, the podcast listener, what each candidate's platform would be as it relates to the healthcare community. And then you take that information and do with it what you will. Nick, do you agree with that sentiment there?
Yeah, wholeheartedly, Corey. We don't want to project any position onto FIA itself. Any policy or public opinions voiced are wholly our own, all the standard disclaimers.
Excellent. Well, with that, how about I get us started, Nick? And I'll start us off with one of the big Trump healthcare, and really it was a Trump healthcare win, I would say, in 2016, and it's going to be at the forefront of his agenda if he is elected to a second term, and that is out-of-network surprise bills and price transparency. So we have all lived under the No Surprise Act now for going on 4 years. The effective date was back in 2021 for the protections for consumers that patients can no longer be balance billed for your three big buckets being treated by an out-of-network physician at an in-network facility, your air ambulances, and your out-of-network emergencies. So the Trump administration in 2016, Trump administration was able to pass that through the Consolidated Appropriations Act. And really, the Trump-Vance ticket has doubled down that they want to do more. For those of you who don't know, this podcast is being recorded in August of 2024. J.D. Vance just did a round of the Sunday morning news shows this past week. And one of his big talking points was expanding and continuing the work as it relates to price transparency and No Surprise Acts. And really, Vance kind of pigeonholes it into his larger agenda. If you've listened to Vance speak at all, he is focused on the family, for lack of a better phrase. And he believes that one of the ways to make sure that families are able to get started and that middle class, working class individuals can participate in the economy, that is making sure that they're not hit with these surprise medical bills. So he's pledging to continue the fight against unexpected out-of-network medical bills. Now, what does that mean? I read through Agenda 47, which is posted on the Trump campaign's website. And like a lot of Trump's policies, it's very general. and there's not a lot of specifics. So this is a little bit of speculation here, but I think that there's ripe ground for them to expand the protections out into ground ambulance. There's already been some calls for that. It's one of those situations that gets a little bit tricky because a lot of ground ambulances are owned by municipalities. So how that would be implemented would be interesting, to say the least. But I think that you might be looking at more protections for patients when it comes to these out-of-network medical bills. And then also, I think really what the administration should do, regardless of whether it's Harris or Trump, is really to look at the dispute resolution process as it stands today. As you all have heard over and over from FIA or from anyone that has a pulse within the industry that is writing or speaking on the No Surprise Act, the projections were wrong about the volumes, which is causing a delay for all the timelines that it comes to the NSA. You actually now have case law saying that federal courts can't enforce non-payment of IDR determinations. That surely will be challenged and ran up the federal ladder, probably in front of the Supreme Court at somehow, because you at least have in one circuit a court saying that they cannot enforce IDR determinations to make a health plan pay when the determination was against them. So I think that the NSA was a good start. Price transparency was a good start. The Trump 2024 platform is going to expand on those protections and continue the urge with price transparency. So that would be my first prong to discuss here, Nick.
Man, Corey, really throwing me in the deep end there with the Consolidated Appropriations Act and the NSA and the whole IDR process. I think one of the biggest things that has to be said about the NSA and the Consolidated Appropriations Act more broadly is that this is probably the biggest change to our nation's healthcare system since the Affordable Care Act. And, we're still sort of handling all the repercussions that came from it. And I think the biggest one is kind of what we've seen in the IDR process. And we've had a lot of clients kind of struggling with the IDR process because it does feel very much skewed in favor of providers. It also feels like it's a process that is still fairly opaque. I know for a fact, some of the clients that I've spoken with and worked with, they're really struggling with how opaque and how final the system can seem. It doesn't seem like the plans and the TPAs that are helping them have a lot of opportunity to push back or even appeal any kind of issues that might arise during the IDR process. It feels like once it's on the rails, you just kind of have to lift your hands up and scream woo, because that roller coaster is going to go where it goes and you don't have a lot of say in it. So I will say that I'm looking forward to seeing what the Trump and Vance campaign says more on this, if they do come out with any more specifics up until the election. And if they do get elected, I'm excited to see hopefully what they do to improve the NSA and the IDR process. Whoever gets elected, honestly, will hopefully continue to refine the process just to make it better for plans and for participants.
Absolutely, because that was the whole goal in the first place, right? Was to ease burden on patients. And it was a good start, but there's certainly some shortfalls in it. So regardless of the next administration, I think there's work to do here.
Yeah, fully agree. Well, Corey, what do you say? My turn? You ready for one of mine?
Let's hear it.
All right, cool. One of the things that, again, if you haven't heard, over the last month, there's been many developments in the 2024 presidential campaign. One of the big ones being that President Biden dropped out of the race, and now Kamala Harris is essentially the Democratic nominee for president. And I think she has yet to actually formally announce her healthcare platform, really. I think the last time the Democratic Party's official platform was updated was actually right before President Biden pulled out of the race. But I think one of the best things we can do is kind of look at some of the things Harris did during her time in the Biden administration and look to her 2019 campaign for some of the policies she was proposing and endorsing and thinking about very publicly back then. One of the big things that we've seen the Biden-Harris administration do is defending the Affordable Care Act. And one of the big defenses that we saw come up recently was their defense of the ACA's contraceptive and preventive care mandates in federal courts in the Braidwood v. Becerra case. This didn't make it up to the Supreme Court, so you probably haven't heard us talk about it in any of our big SCOTUS breakdowns. But this case went up to the Fifth Circuit. Effectively, the plaintiffs argued that the ACA's contraceptive mandate and preventive care requirements basically were an abrogation of their religious freedom, which is a pretty, common argument. We've seen it happen before. And this case was effectively challenging the preventive care mandates that are put out by the administrative bodies that make those determinations. Specifically, the big ones you've probably all heard of, like the Advisory Committee on the Immunization Practices, ACIP, the Human Resources and Services Administration, HRSA, and the U.S. Preventive Services Task Force. Basically, the preventive care mandate is implemented through those administrative agencies pushing out determinations on what does constitute preventive care for certain patients, be it for women, be it for minors, be it for the elderly. That rule was challenged and effectively pushed back down to the district court. I think it went back to everyone's favorite conservative judge in Amarillo, Texas. But that didn't fully dismiss the case. We could see this case come back. And now that we do have the SCOTUS decision in Loper-Bright, and we know that Chevron deference is no longer in play, I think that those preventive care determinations are going to be much, much, much more vulnerable. If they're not challenged further under the Braidwood v. Becerra case, we could easily see other legal challenges under the new paradigm of agency deference post-Chevron. So I think that my big takeaway here essentially is just to say that the preventive care services under the ACA and the contraceptive mandate specifically could be on very shaky ground going forward. So Corey, how does that strike you?
Yeah, I think that, Loper-Bright is really going to be the wrench in the machine here, right? Nick, Brady and I, a few podcasts ago, kind of broke that case down. And really, not just this specific contraceptive issue, but any of these kind of admin law issues that could be brought up, the deference now is gone to the administrative agencies. And so there's going to be more federal leeway from judges involved in the case to be able to read and interpret the plain meaning of the law, or if it is an ambiguous term, the administrative agency just isn't going to have deference given their way. I think you pointing out that there is going to be some shaky ground on this issue is the correct way to look at it. You know, we have had a couple of Supreme Court cases that have not answered this issue, but touched on it. Hobby Lobby comes to mind back in the day, where it was a religious liberty case for the privately held organization. So I think that there's going to be more and more challenges coming this way, and whether or not federally across the board unilaterally requiring certain types of contraceptives, whether or not that's going to be allowed is going to be an issue that, like many issues in the admin law range, will have to be decided at some point. But as of right now, I think we're just speculating.
Yeah, I think you're 100% right there. I think, however, the election plays out at the end of this year, I think is going to be a big factor in whether the federal government steps in pretty hard to try to defend any of that agency action. But either way, yeah, Loper-Bright really changed the game when it comes to any admin action and agency regulations. So I think not just in healthcare, but pretty much every industry is kind of bracing to see when that dam breaks, what it's going to look like. So we've got another roller coaster to jump on pretty soon here.
Well, there's one thing that you can't say about the healthcare regulatory industry. You can't say that it's boring. and the winds of change are blowing, and that's why FIA is here to help provide all the support that we can throughout this tumultuous regulatory time. So I'm actually, based on your first topic there, Nick, I'm going to pivot mine. I was going to talk about opioids next, but since you talked about contraception a little bit, I think it leads naturally to another hot button issue that I was going to speak about a little bit later, but we'll stay in the realm of the topic and talk about Trump's position on abortion and mifepristone in a post-Dobbs world. And I don't know if it's fair to say that it's a 180 from 2016 Trump, his position on abortion. I think that we all know that Trump was able to appoint 3 justices onto the Supreme Court that decided the Dobbs case, which overturned Roe. But Trump has now stated that really when it comes to issues of abortion, and even when it comes to the issue of mifepristone, commonly known as the abortion drug, that his position now in his second administration, that in a post-Dobbs world, that this is going to be a state-by-state decision on how these things have been carried out. In his debate against Biden in June, he voiced his own personal belief that he believes that there should be exceptions to abortion bans. Specifically, he stated for rape, incest, life and death of the mother would be his personal feelings on the topic. But ultimately, he said that this is going to be a state-by-state decision in accordance with the Dobbs decision, that if California has a more lax policy on abortion than Ohio, who has a more lax policy on abortion than a state like Texas, then that's the way that the system should be operating, that it is going to be a state-by-state determination. And again, we're pointing back to J.D. Vance again, even though he is not the presidential candidate. He was the one who spoke directly on this topic, again, just this past week. And he was asked several questions specifically as it pertained to mifepristone. And again, Vance's position is that this is going to be a state-by-state determination. He was pressed very hard on if the Trump-Vance administration would take into account for the position of FDA commissioner their position on mifepristone. He said that there would be a litany of factors that would be in play when making a determination on who the next FDA commissioner would be, but it would not be a deciding factor. And ultimately, if one state allows the prescription of mifepristone for abortions and another state doesn't, then that's going to be within the scope of the Dobbs decision, and it would be up to that state-by-state determination. So if you have one state that outlaws mifepristone, that he would expect that physicians in that state would not be able to prescribe it, the same way that if there's limitation on opioids in a specific state and how they're to be prescribed in acute situations versus emergent situations, then physicians would be expected to behave within whatever the parameters their state law and their state prescribing laws would allow them to do. So a physician in one state may be able to prescribe it, a physician in another state may not be able to prescribe it, but it's definitely more, in my opinion, a hands-off approach federally, which I do think is a change from 2016 Trump, who ran on what many would consider a pretty hardline stance on pro-life. But now that we are post-Dobbs, this is now a state-by-state decision in the eyes of the potential Trump 2025 administration.
Yeah, I think the last time I heard President Trump answer a question on abortion, I think he said, "You have to follow your heart," which I guess was his shorthand for essentially, deferring state by state, letting each state decide for itself. And I think, that does feel like a bit of a 180 from the previous campaign, where he sort of touted himself as the most anti-abortion candidate ever. He really clung to the appointment of multiple Supreme Court justices who he bragged would, overturn Roe v. Wade, and that's exactly what happened. I think from the Harris campaign, her time in the Biden-Harris administration, you saw them do a lot to try to defend abortion care and reproductive health rights in the Supreme Court and in federal courts leading up to it. It was the Biden-Harris administration's FDA that it loosened some of the restrictions around mifepristone that sort of triggered a couple of those cases. I know that as a senator, at least, Kamala Harris opposed the Hyde Amendment, which is where we get those exceptions. Basically, the Hyde Amendment is a restriction on federal funds from going to fund abortion care, with the exception of situations for like rape and incest, which is where we get a lot of those caveats from. So I think it's safe to say that the two camps in the upcoming election are about as divided on that issue as can be. I do know one of the interesting parts of the Biden-Harris administration's push to support reproductive rights was, I think that Kamala Harris was literally the first vice president to tour an active abortion clinic. And the abortion clinic she toured was in Minnesota with her now vice presidential candidate, Tim Walz. So I think it's safe to say that the two of them are both pretty firmly in the reproductive rights camp. And this next election will pretty heavily determine the direction that the rest of the country goes in the future, whether they can help Congress push for a national, reinstitution of Roe v. Wade and reproduction rights on a national level, or if it goes further and fractures more into a state-by-state decision of whether those type of rights will be protected or more heavily restricted.
Yeah, diametrically opposed Great term for it. I think that the spin zone from the Trump Vance camp is interesting and possibly, worth note. That Vance's talking point is, hey, listen, it's a state by state determination now. Let's all just agree on that and then move forward. The common ground should be that it's going to be a state by state determination. So let's put this very divisive issue behind us now, since the power is now reversed back to the states, and let's move forward. I think that that's an interesting take on what has transpired over the last couple of years. And yep, we'll see where it goes from here, depending on the outcome in November.
Absolutely. And that actually kind of leads to one of my next topics. Like I said, we haven't seen an official update to the Democratic platform for healthcare since Kamala Harris took over as the official nominee here in August. But one of the things we can look to is not just her past record, but now we can also look at Tim Walz's healthcare policies. And he's had some pretty progressive pushes back in his state of Minnesota. He proclaimed healthcare a basic human right during an inauguration address. He helped push for pretty broad reforms on how medical debt is collected and treated in the state of Minnesota. He banned medical debt from impacting credit scores. He created strong protections from unethical medical debt collections practices. And he required medical providers to publish their debt collection practices for medical debt. One of the big developments on a national level was capping insulin prices for Medicare recipients. In the state of Minnesota, the Walz gubernatorial administration capped insulin prices for all Minnesotans, even those not on Medicare. And Walz has also done a lot in that state to lay groundwork for a public option, which is something that I think scares a lot of people, especially in our industry. Any type of single payer approach or anything that kind of tiptoes down the path towards single payer is a little alarming, but a public option is sort of a half step towards that direction, where essentially in Minnesota, the government would allow anyone to buy into Medicaid and use that essentially as their healthcare, instead of having to have an employer-sponsored plan or having to buy individual coverage on the marketplaces. So I guess, Corey, to you, I would say, how do some of those fairly progressive healthcare policies strike you?
Well, I think the first policy that you brought up should have bipartisan support overwhelmingly, and that's medical debt, right?
Right.
Number one cause of bankruptcy in the country. Medical debt oftentimes affects low-income individuals far more than it does upper middle class to upper class individuals like anything. I think that there have been good steps taken under the Biden-Harris administration. The three major credit bureaus wiped off a lot of medical debt under a certain dollar threshold. Now, if I believe it's either $500 or $1,000, so don't quote me out there in podcast land, that if the medical debt is that low, it can't even be reported onto your credit report. Therefore, it's not points against you when you're trying to refinance, or maybe you're trying to buy your first house or whatever you're wanting to do there, purchase a car. So I think that is a great bipartisan initiative. Regardless of the next administration, I hope that there are serious steps taken to address the predatory practices that a lot of providers engage in when it comes to medical debt collection. Again, the No Surprise Act was a good step in the right direction, but it didn't do anything really to address the billions of dollars in outstanding medical debt that exists right now. So I would like to see the next administration take up that cause. And yeah, single payer, it's Kamala Harris in a iconic moment of her debate in 2019 raised her hand when the question was asked in the Democratic primary of who supports single payer. And I think she backtracked on that position a few days after that debate, and it's unclear where she stands now on single payer. The healthcare industry in the United States is a top 5 GDP worldwide, so it would be interesting to see what that administration would do. Are they going to get rid of all private insurance? Don't think so, but that doesn't mean that it wouldn't be on the table. So it's just something to keep an eye on there. We are sufficiently taking up a lot of time here, Nick. So I'm going to kind of go through this last point real quick here. That way you can get yours and we can get out of here. But the last thing that I think really touches the healthcare industry is the opioid epidemic. Trump, in his first administration, declared the opioid crisis a public health emergency, which opened up a lot more funding for substance abuse treatment options. He ties the opioid epidemic very closely to the border. So it's one of those things where you can't really parse it out because, I think that there are issues with that, but he lumps it together. And basically, his way of combating the opioid epidemic would be stronger border, more federal enforcement at the border, more federal presence in local drug investigations, and increased penalties for drug smugglers, especially repeat offenders. At one point, and I didn't get to independently verify this, but at one point, even if a drug dealer dealt drugs laced in fentanyl that led to the death of an individual, would that drug dealer be up for a sentence that could include the death penalty? So the opioid epidemic, we talked about that a few podcasts ago, is very near and dear to me. It is a crisis in the country that is affecting multiple individuals across the socioeconomic landscape, and it's something that needs to be dealt with. So I think that the Trump administration would continue to fight for decreasing the amount of opioids on the streets and ramping up the enforcement and penalties for offenders that are dealing in opioids.
Yeah, I think almost everybody in the country at this point is at least connected to somebody whose life has been pretty severely impacted by the ongoing opioid use crisis. And I hope whoever does win in November has a chance to put some good ideas in place to try to address that. I know that the Biden-Harris administration took some steps to try to increase availability of methadone and other treatments for opioid use, but yeah, there's so much work that I think needs to be done to address the scourge of opioids across the country. The only other thing I had to talk about, I did just want to go back and confirm, really. I found a tweet where the Harris campaign announced that she would not be pushing single payer as president. But it does sound, especially with Tim Walz and his positions as her VP pick, we could see the Harris-Walz campaign and possibly their administration pushing in the direction of a public option. We could see what that might do if the private healthcare providers and employer-sponsored health plans have to compete against a publicly funded healthcare option. So that's something big that, as it develops, I'm sure we'll jump on more pods in the future, be it you and me, Corey, or whomever, but we'll have a lot to say down the road, I'm sure. Did you want to try to squeeze in your non-healthcare related topic?
Well, I think the big thing for me as a father and as father of four, the expansion of the child tax credit is a lucrative proposition put forward by the Trump-Vance campaign. Vance was pushed on what he would expand the child tax credit to. He threw the number out of $5,000 per child, which is more than double what it currently stands at now. Vance has a big focus based on his story and his upbringing of making sure that a family dynamic and a family unit can be supported in the country. So I think that it will be interesting to see how that topic is debated in the future and how, if elected, how he could implement some of those proposals that he has. I think there's also some tax subsidies for stay-at-home moms, private school vouchers, all these kind of things that kind of touch on making sure that families can make the best decisions for themselves, families can get started, and families don't feel some of the economic pressures.
Yeah, I hear you there, man. My wife and I just got married last year and no kids yet, but I can definitely get behind expansions of the child tax credit. For me, not being a father yet, my big drain on my income is probably my student loans. So I'm excited to see whomever takes office, whatever they can do to help me out there would be very, very welcome. But that's just me.
Talk about predatory industries. That's certainly one.
Yeah. Let's take a bunch of dumb 18-year-olds and get them to sign a note for something they'll never afford. Can't wait. But yeah, I think that does it for us today. Corey, did you have anything else you wanted to tack on at the end here?
No, Nick, I don't think that there's anything else that I could add here. We took up a lot of time. I think it's an important topic. It's on the forefront of everyone's mind. It's dominating the news cycles here. Hopefully you learned something from this podcast. Hopefully Nick and I did a good job of outlining some policies and prospective policies for each of the administrations. And hopefully you're more informed now than you were when the podcast started.
Yeah, same. Echo all of that. Thanks everyone for tuning in. Pat, thank you, sir, as ever, for keeping us going and for getting these podcasts cranked out. Until next time, everyone, keep an eye on the election and keep your eyes out for more to come from the FIA group. We'll talk to you next time.